Imagine this for a moment, not as a royal headline, not as palace gossip, but as a hauntingly personal moment buried beneath decades of royal silence. A quiet room, old belongings being sorted, memories scattered across velvet trays and delicate gold chains. And then, something completely unexpected, something no one planned to find, something that would shake even a king. Because hidden beneath the glitter of royal jewels, beneath diamonds once worn under flashing cameras, beneath pearls that witnessed state dinners and royal tours, there was a folded piece of paper, a simple handwritten note, and written on that paper was one name: Charles. Yes, the same Charles whose marriage to Princess Diana became one of the most dissected relationships in modern history. The same Charles the world believed Diana had emotionally moved far beyond. And yet, years after her tragic death, there he was, reportedly standing in front of a jewelry box that once belonged to the most photographed woman on earth, staring at a message she had quietly left behind. A message meant only for him. And when he finally read it, something happened that those present would never forget. Because according to insiders, Charles didn't speak. He didn't explain. He simply walked away for a moment, holding the note in silence, and when he returned, his eyes were red. But to understand why this moment was so powerful, we have to go back. Not to the crash in Paris, not to the divorce, but to the quiet world Diana built around herself long before any of this was discovered. Because Diana understood something most people never think about. She understood legacy. For Diana, jewelry was never just decoration. It was language, silent communication. Every piece she wore carried meaning, and those who studied her life later would notice something extraordinary. Diana was constantly sending messages without saying a single word. Inside her famous jewelry box was a timeline of her life. Gifts from the Queen, pieces inherited from the Spencer family, bracelets given to friends, brooches worn during diplomatic visits. Each object tied to a moment, a relationship, a memory. And Diana used those objects almost like emotional bookmarks. Royal historians have pointed out how deliberately she handled these pieces. When she wore certain items, people noticed. When she refused to wear others, people noticed even more. Remember the famous moment at the White House dinner in 1985 when Diana wore a sapphire necklace as a headband while dancing with John Travolta? That wasn't just fashion rebellion. It was Diana quietly bending royal rules, proving she would not be completely controlled by them. She was always communicating. And sometimes the message wasn't meant for the world. Sometimes it was meant for just one person, which is why the placement of that note matters so much. Because Diana didn't leave it out in the open. She didn't place it in a visible drawer or between letters where it would easily be discovered. No, it was hidden beneath the velvet lining of her jewelry box, tucked beneath the very objects that symbolized her life inside the monarchy. That kind of placement doesn't happen accidentally. It suggests intention. Almost like Diana knew, someday someone important would eventually find it. And that raises the most chilling question of all. Was she expecting Charles to find it? Now consider the timing of everything that followed Diana's death in 1997. When a member of the royal family dies, their personal belongings are not immediately sorted or distributed. The process is slow, methodical, and deeply private. Items are cataloged, some are archived, others remain with the estate until the right moment arrives. And grief complicates everything, because when people lose someone suddenly, they often avoid touching their belongings for years. It feels too final, too painful. Psychologists call this phenomenon continuing bonds, the idea that people maintain emotional connections with the deceased through objects they once owned. Opening a drawer, touching an old piece of clothing, reading a letter, these small acts become emotional bridges between past and present. So Diana's belongings were handled carefully over time, piece by piece, visit after visit. And during one of those quiet moments, something unexpected happened. The jewelry box was opened. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Velvet trays, rings, earrings, familiar pieces the world had seen 100 times before. But beneath the lining, there was something else. A folded sheet of paper. When it was opened, the handwriting was unmistakable, Diana's, and written on the outside was Charles's name. Imagine the tension in that room for a second. People realizing what they had just found. A private message written by the Princess of Wales, addressed to the man whose complicated marriage with her had been broadcast across the world. This wasn't history anymore. This was something raw, something unfinished. According to those present, Charles was there when the note surfaced. No cameras, no journalists, no royal ceremony, just a quiet discovery. He took the letter, stepped away from the others, and read it alone. Those who saw him afterwards said the change in his face was immediate, not dramatic, not theatrical, just heavy. The kind of emotional weight people carry when a memory suddenly comes back to life. And here's the part that makes this story even more fascinating. The contents of the note were never fully revealed, not to the public, not to reporters, not even to historians, which means the most important words Diana ever wrote to Charles may remain between them forever. But some details have quietly emerged through sources close to the royal household. And what they suggest is deeply surprising, because if you think Diana used that note to accuse him, to reopen reopen old wounds or to remind him of their painful marriage, you would be completely wrong. The tone of the letter, according to insiders, was not bitter. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even confrontational. It was gentle, reflective, almost peaceful, which is astonishing when you remember how chaotic their relationship had been. Affairs, loneliness, public humiliation. Diana herself openly described feeling emotionally unstable and isolated during the marriage. She had every reason to leave behind anger, but instead, she left behind something else entirely. And when Charles read those words, years after she was gone, it forced him to confront emotions he may never have fully processed. Because the note didn't focus on their failed marriage. It focused on something much more powerful: their sons, William and Harry. Sources say Diana wrote about them with deep hope and spoke about Charles not as the man who hurt her, but as their father. And suddenly, the entire narrative shifts. Because when someone you lost years ago speaks to you with unexpected kindness, especially after a complicated relationship, it creates a strange emotional collision. Relief, regret, grief, all at once. Psychologists describe this as one-directional communication, a message from someone who is no longer alive, leaving the reader unable to respond, unable to apologize, unable to explain, unable to say the things that might have healed the past. Charles reportedly sat with that reality, holding a note written by the woman who once stood beside him on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the woman whose funeral brought the entire world to tears. And in that moment, the story of Charles and Diana may have become far more complicated than the world ever imagined. Because maybe, just maybe, the final words she left behind weren't about blame at all. They were about understanding. And what those words truly meant changes everything. And here is where the story becomes even more unsettling. Because when we strip away the headlines, the documentaries, the decades of public arguments about who was right and who was wrong, we are left with something far more uncomfortable: the possibility that the story the world believed about Charles and Diana may never have been the full truth. For years, the public narrative felt simple, almost too simple. Diana was the beloved people's princess, the emotional heart of the monarchy, a woman who hugged AIDS patients when the world still feared touching them, a mother who knelt down to talk to children at eye level, a royal who broke protocol with compassion. And Charles? He became the villain of the story. Cold, distant, obsessed with duty, the husband who never truly loved her, the man whose relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles haunted their marriage from the beginning. It was a story that felt clean and satisfying for the public. Heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators. But life, especially inside royal palaces, is rarely that simple. Because behind the palace walls, both Charles and Diana were trapped in something far larger than themselves. An ancient institution built on restraint, silence, and emotional discipline. Charles was raised in a world where feelings were almost considered weakness. Royal children were taught to endure, not express, to maintain composure, not vulnerability. The very qualities that made Diana magnetic to the public were the same qualities the royal system never fully understood. Biographer Tina Brown once described Charles as a man who had been emotionally conditioned since childhood to suppress his instincts, not because he lacked feelings, but because he was taught never to show them. That kind of upbringing leaves scars, and those scars collided disastrously with Diana's emotional openness. Where Diana needed reassurance, Charles retreated into silence. Where Diana sought affection, Charles relied on duty. Two people speaking completely different emotional languages, locked inside the same royal marriage. And when that marriage collapsed, the world saw only the explosion. What they didn't see was the aftermath. Because when Diana died suddenly in August 1997, the shock was not just global, it was deeply personal for Charles. Imagine the emotional contradiction of that moment. A woman you once loved, a woman whose pain you were accused of causing, a woman with whom your relationship ended in bitterness, suddenly gone forever. No final conversation, no closure, just absence. People close to Charles later described something the public rarely heard about. After Diana's death, there were moments when he sat quietly in rooms she once used. Moments when he spoke about her softly to friends. Not with anger, not with defensiveness, with sadness. Not the sadness of a political figure, but the sadness of someone confronting the complicated ruins of a relationship that ended too soon. And that is what makes the note so emotionally explosive. Because Diana's final message, according to sources, did not punish him. It did not accuse him. Instead, it acknowledged something many people overlooked in their story. They were still connected, not as husband and wife, but as parents. The note reportedly spoke about William and Harry, about her hopes for them, about the importance of their father in their lives. Diana, despite everything that happened between them, recognized that Charles would always be the central male figure in their son's world. That perspective changes everything, because if Diana had truly viewed Charles as an enemy, she would not not have left him a message filled with reflection and hope. You do not write gentle words to someone you hate. You do not leave a personal note hidden among your most treasured belongings for someone you want erased from your life. That gesture alone suggests something quietly profound. Diana had moved beyond pure anger, and maybe Charles realized that too late. This is where grief becomes complicated, because Diana herself once said something that now feels almost prophetic. Everyone needs to be valued. That sentence captures everything about who she was. Diana believed deeply in human connection. She believed in kindness. She believed in emotional honesty. The note she left behind, hidden beneath the jewels of a royal life, seems to embody that same belief. It wasn't meant for the public. It wasn't meant to change history. It was simply meant to reach one person, Charles. And when he finally read those words, years after losing her, the silence between them may have said more than any royal speech ever could. Because sometimes the most powerful messages are not delivered in front of crowds. Sometimes they are discovered quietly, hidden beneath velvet, waiting for the moment when someone is finally ready to read them. And somewhere inside the royal archives, inside a private collection of memories, that folded piece of paper still exists. A final message from Princess Diana, not to the world, but to the man who once stood beside her, long before the story ended. Long